Good evening and welcome everyone to the annual Richard W. Smith Lecture on the History of the Civil War. I am Professor Michael Flam, Chair of the History Department, and on behalf of Ohio Wesleyan and my colleagues, especially Barbara Turgeon, I am delighted that you have chosen to join us tonight on Zoom, although of course, we all hoped and wished that we could gather in person. The speaker and I intend to keep our remarks relatively brief this evening so that we have time for your questions and can end this presentation at or close to 8 p.m. Zoom fatigue is real, as most of us already know by now. But I do want to begin by acknowledging two very important people. Let me first ask, can you hear me? Are you hearing me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to begin by acknowledging two very important people. First, I want to thank our administrator, Ms. Dawn Wright, who worked tirelessly to arrange and publicize this talk. Dawn is, quite simply, extraordinary and irreplaceable. She is truly the heart and soul of the History Department. Second, I would like to recognize Richard W. Smith, an institution at Ohio Wesleyan for more than 3 decades, who will celebrate his 98th birthday tomorrow with his beloved wife, Betty. Dick began his teaching career here in 1950 with, believe it or not, a senior colleague who had joined the faculty during World War I. During his career, Dick dazzled generations of students and inspired more than a dozen to pursue history Ph.D.s. They, in turn, have endowed this lectureship in his honor. The other day, I had the great pleasure of speaking directly with Dick. Tonight, he would like to extend hearty greetings to all and his deep gratitude, in particular, to Evan and Anita Buki, Evan Corns, and Lloyd Ferguson, former students and prominent graduates who took the lead in founding, funding, and guiding this lectureship. Now, I would like to share with you a few minutes from an interview I conducted with Dick in 2016. More than ever, I believe we can draw inspiration from Dick's reflections.
Well, good morning. Coming here and meeting your wife, Betty.
Yes.
But putting that, critical moment and event aside, what is your most lasting memory of your time at Ohio Wesleyan? A person, a moment, what is it?
I'll have to take your question and broaden it a bit because I don't want to be too restrictive. I think my personal moment is really a lifetime. Everything I said a moment ago earlier, I really love Elliott Hall and can see the beauty of it. Other buildings on campus, the Renaissance University Hall, Sturgis, and this and that, what we're building. Despite the fact that the streets, the old Indian trails bypass the campus and break it up. Yeah, the physical campus, but the total experience, family experience, learning experience, seeing our graduates do things and really accomplish something, pride in what they're doing. Got a Nobel Prize, this and that, even though I didn't, and the men and women I've worked with. So there's no real moment you can single out, Mike. I'm ducking a question a bit. I'm changing a bit. It blurs into a total image, if I may say, a continuing image. Seen when the 5th and the 20th, I'm sorry, not the 5th, but when the 20th reunion, 25th reunion, here comes X back and Y and J. Suddenly they're doing this, doing that, catching up on their life. based on a solid conviction that we individuals must make a contribution. We must, absolute imperative to improve life broadly for all of humanity.
Well, Dick, on behalf of the university and the department, thank you for your
Thank you again, Dick, for those thoughts and for all that you have done for Ohio Wesleyan over the years. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Mark Grimsley of The Ohio State University, where he teaches military history and 19th century US history. Professor Grimsley's first book, The Hard Hand of War, Union Military Policy Towards Southern Civilians, 1861 to 1865, won the Gilder Lehrman Prize, awarded annually for the finest scholarly work in English on Abraham Lincoln, the American Civil War soldier, or the American Civil War era. The author, co-author, or co-editor of several other works, he was also awarded the U.S. Army Outstanding Civilian Service Medal in 2010. Tonight, Professor Grimsley will present a talk on one of Delaware County's own, General William S. Rosecrans, and the pitfalls of command. Mark, it is my pleasure to yield command of this Zoom to you.
Thanks very much. I want to say that tonight's Smith Lecture is unique in three respects. To start with, in the 19-year history of the lecture series, this is the first and hopefully the last that will be given via Zoom rather than in person. Second, it will be among the shortest because, as Mike has just alluded to, there is a thin line between educating someone via Zoom and slowly crushing their soul. And I don't want to do that to you. And finally, it's the first to be given on a topic of which the speaker is not necessarily a nationally recognized expert. And I'm not on Rosecrans. So what business do I have giving a lecture on William S. Rosecrans tonight? Well, it's simple. Dick Smith asked me to. Yes, Richard W. Smith, for whom these lecture series is named, asked me to give a talk on Rosecrans. That's good enough for me. I hope it will be good enough for you, and it's an honor. Still, why a lecture on Rosecrans? Let me share my screen with you. Here's the title slides. Why a lecture on Rosecrans? Well, because Rosecrans was born right here, or right there in Delaware County, Kingston Township to be precise. And for that reason, Dick insisted that there be a Smith lecture devoted to Rosecrans. Now, as soon as I began my research on Rosecrans for this talk, I discovered that Rosecrans' parents moved from Delaware County to Licking County when young William was still an infant. Nonetheless, an equestrian statue of Rosecrans stands on the town square in the town of Sunbury in Kingston Township. And it is true that in May 1884, Rosecrans came to the city of Delaware, Ohio, for a Decoration Day ceremony at the Soldiers' Monument in front of the courthouse. One listener recalled Rosecrans as saying that he did not propose to make a speech in Delaware, but would simply give a free and easy talk with his old neighbors, and went on to say that he remembered the town very well, which, given the fact that he left Delaware County when he was an infant, seems like a bit of an odd statement. But by the time he made it, Rosecrans had been in public life for many decades, and so naturally, he remembered the town very well. In any case, every life's journey begins somewhere. That of William Stark Rosecrans began in Delaware County. His journey, as I want to discuss it tonight, eventually led him to the field behind me, located in northern Georgia on the Chickamauga battlefield, scene of a bloody two-day clash between Union and Confederate armies. But for a single fatal day, September 20th, 1863, the second day of the battle to be exact, Rosecrans would likely have earned a place in the front rank of Civil War commanders. As matters stand, he reached, as one biographer expressed it, only the edge of glory. We all have moments that define us. Some of us get to choose those moments. Most of us do not. I know a woman whose image of her father is crystallized in a single teasing remark he leveled at her when she was a small child. I'm the father of a 10-year-old daughter, Chloe, shown here 3 years ago, taking a quick look at the Rosecrans statue in Sunbury before taking a much longer look at a nearby statue of Johnny Appleseed, which interested him much more, which, by the way, would have made General Grant very happy for reasons I'll get to after a while. The thought that anything I can do or say can wind up defining how she remembers me is never far from my mind. But at least I can take solace in knowing that that defining moment, whatever it may be, will merely be symbolic of most of the moments we spent together as parent and child. The way she ended up remembering me is probably how I shall deserve to be remembered. But in public life, the moments that define us can be grotesquely unfair. Not long ago, Colin Powell passed away due to complications from COVID-19, one of 750,000 Americans to have died of COVID as of this evening. For Powell, the defining day of his life proved to be February 5th, 2003, the date of his address to the United Nations, making the Bush administration's case for war with Iraq. In later years, Powell regretted both the speech and feared that it would be prominent in his obituary. In the case of the New York Times, at least, it was literally the first sentence of his obituary. Colin L. Powell, who in 4 decades of public life served as the nation's top soldier, diplomat, and national security advisor, and whose speech at the United Nations in 2003 helped pave the way for the United States to go to war in Iraq, died on Monday. The first 15 years of Rosecrans' own 78-year life were dominated by the dust and clutter of general stores. He was the de facto accountant of his father's store in Licking County, followed by a stint at a second store in Utica, Ohio, followed by a stint at a third store in Mansfield, Ohio. The modest family finances precluded a college education for young William, and so William solved the problem by going to West Point, which offered a free education predicated, of course, on a military career. He matriculated in 1838, just shy of his 19th birthday, and graduated 4 years later near the top of the class of 1842. Rosecrans missed the Mexican War of 1846-47, thanks to assignments that kept him in the United States. And the lean salary of an Army lieutenant led him to resign in 1853 to seek higher income in the business world. At that, he excelled, particularly as a partner at a refinery in Cincinnati. But here, an ironically named safety lamp exploded in his face, leaving him with a deep scar by his mouth that gave him the appearance of wearing a permanent smirk. However, his business career carried him ever upward until by the winter of 1861, he stood on the brink of what he believed would be a prosperous, lucrative future. But the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861 abruptly placed him on a very different path. He offered his services to the governor of Ohio and soon found himself a brigadier general of volunteers. Time precludes an extended account of his early Civil War career. Suffice it to say that he performed brilliantly, excelling in one assignment after another until in late October 1862, he was placed in command of what would shortly be known as the Army of the Cumberland, posted in and around Nashville, Tennessee. In December 1862, Rosecrans took the army on a winter campaign marching his army eastward toward the Confederate Army of Tennessee under General Braxton Bragg. On New Year's Eve, the rival armies clashed in the Battle of Stones River, a brutal slugfest in which Rosecrans' army narrowly escaped disaster, but which ended up forcing Bragg's army to retreat some 40 miles to the east, to the town of Tullahoma. Although a near-run thing, Rosecrans' victory at Stones River won him the heartfelt thanks of President Abraham Lincoln, coming as it did in the wake of a serious Union reversals like the Battle of Fredericksburg. Lincoln called Stones River, quote, a hard-earned victory, which, had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over, end quote. For the next 6 months, the two armies, Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland, Bragg's Army of Tennessee, remained motionless, with Bragg standing on the defensive while Rosecrans allowed his army to recover from Stones River and meticulously prepared for the summer campaign. Then, from late June until early September, less than 2 months, he conducted a nearly bloodless campaign that ejected Bragg from Tennessee by a series of maneuvers still considered one of the war's master strokes. While elements of the Army of the Cumberland seized the crucial railroad center of Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the lower right of the map that you're looking at, the bulk of Rosecrans' army continued its campaign of maneuver several miles to the south, forcing its way through the high wooded ridges that define the border between Tennessee and northern Georgia. An alarmed Confederate government detached out 8,000 men from General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and sent it by rail to join Bragg's army. The force was commanded by no less a general than James Longstreet, whom Lee regarded as his best corps commander and who he affectionately dubbed his old war horse. Lee's old war horse arrived just in time and reinforced Bragg's army enough to enable Bragg to launch one of the fiercest counteroffensives of the war, which took place amid the rolling hills, dense woods, and scattered farms just west of a wide stream called Chickamauga Creek. The fighting exploded on September 19th, with Rosecrans' army partially surprised but able to hold its own. That night, Rosecrans slept in what is now a bed and breakfast. I once slept in the same bedroom that he did. Worn down by weeks of campaigning, followed by this terrible battle, but confident of victory the next day. But the next day proved to be the fatal day toward which his life had progressed inexorably since those brief infant years in Delaware County. It was that day that abruptly stripped him of his hitherto brilliant career, the day that forever stamped him in the often ruthless judgment of history as a might have been. Let us behold the man as he leaves his bed after a fitful, shallow, inadequate slumber and walks out into the crisp early morning of Sunday, September 20th, 1863. He is just 2 weeks past his 44th birthday. Like most men of his time and place, he wears a beard, full but trim. Although red-eyed from too little sleep, he retains his usual energy, a restless energy, what some might call too much energy. He is confident, yet is anything but calm. He talks a lot, giving a rapid series of commands that have an impulsive quality to them. But this is the same man who clawed his way to success in the business world, bounded from success to success in the war's early years, and won victory at Stones River, a narrow victory to be sure, but one that earned President Abraham Lincoln's gratitude. This is the same man who maneuvered an entire Confederate army out of Tennessee and seized one of the South's most strategic cities, Chattanooga, almost without firing a shot. The rattle of musketry begins, accompanied by the steady boom of cannon. The enemy resumes its attack, but the Army of the Cumberland is better prepared and positioned than from the day before. And the first Confederate assaults are clumsy and easily repelled. The sun climbs, the day warms, the noise of battle intensifies. Rosecrans assumes a position on a hill just behind the battle line on his right flank. It isn't a high hill. Ordinarily, it would go almost unnoticed, but it's enough to give Rosecrans a good view of the sector of the battlefield. A clump of staff officers surrounds him. He dictates an unusual number of orders and hustles them off via mounted couriers or to units in the immediate vicinity by his own staff officers. Among the latter, a staff officer takes an urgent message to Division Commander Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood, shown here, scarcely 600 yards from Rosecrans Field Headquarters. The general commanding, it reads, directs you to close up on Reynolds as fast as possible and support him. Wood realizes at once that the order makes no sense. The Reynolds to whom it refers, Major General Joseph Reynolds, commands a division to the north of the sector that Wood is supposed to hold. To close up on Reynolds would mean shifting Wood's own division to connect with the right flank of Reynolds' division. But between those two divisions is a third, under Brigadier General John M. Brannan, so it is obviously impossible to obey this portion of the order. Moreover, to support Reynolds' division would mean placing Wood's own division to Reynolds' rear. That, however, would open a gaping hole in the Union line. The obvious thing to do is to remain in place. The staff officer who has brought the order quickly realizes that it is badly written and does not reflect Rosecrans' intent, which was to have Wood's division close up on Reynolds after Brannan's division had moved back to allow this maneuver. He tries to explain this to Wood, but Wood refuses to listen. The order is imperative, Wood says, and must be obeyed at once. The staff officer begs Wood to wait just 10 minutes so that he can ride back to Rosecrans' headquarters, a mere 600 miles distant, mind you, to clarify the directive. But before doing so, Wood shakes his head, carefully places a slip of paper in a pocket notebook. But before doing so, he allegedly waggles it in front of his division staff. I hold the fatal order of the day, he says, and would not part with it for $5,000. Wood then withdraws his division from its sector to place it behind Reynolds' division. A few minutes later, a Confederate assault begins, led by James Longstreet and two of the best fighting divisions in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Thousands of rebel infantry pour through the gap created by Wood's withdrawal. In the fighting that ensues, the Army of the Cumberland is nearly wrecked. Why on earth did Wood do such a thing? It turns out that in the days preceding September 20th, Rosecrans has twice reprimanded Wood in full view of Wood's staff for failing to carry out an order promptly enough. Wood's literal obedience to an absurd order was, said many then and later, a classic case of payback. Wood apparently wanted to discomfit Rosecrans so badly, he did not care that it might take the loss of a battle and hundreds of lives to do so. An act of greater pettiness would be hard to imagine. Now, when asked to provide a title for tonight's lecture, I had not yet formulated what exactly I would say. So I offered one that gave me a certain room for maneuver, General William S. Rosecrans and the Pitfalls of Command. But having chosen it, I was stuck with it. And now I have to make good on it. In looking up the definition of pitfall, I found that in its original 14th century meaning, pitfall was, quote, a concealed hole into which a person or animal may fall unawares, end quote. I want to suggest that Rosecrans' reputation was sealed by falling into 5 metaphorical pitfalls, statements that deliberately or inadvertently contrived to undermine that reputation. The first pitfall was dug, quite obviously, by General Thomas J. Wood, who used Rosecrans' poorly worded order as an ultimate tool for payback. And I have no doubt that Wood meant to destroy Rosecrans' reputation. I have no doubt that the pitfall he dug for Rosecrans was deliberate. The next pitfall was dug inadvertently by Rosecrans' own chief of staff, fellow Ohioan, and future U.S. President James A. Garfield. Recognizing that after Longstreet's breakthrough, Rosecrans' only hope was to get the remnants of his army to Chattanooga, Old Rosie, as his troops called him, left the battlefield to go to Chattanooga to organize the city's defense. A key subordinate, Major General George H. Thomas, took charge of the troops still organized and able to fight at Chickamauga. The bulk of them took up a position on Snodgrass Hill in what had been the center of the Union line. Thomas inspired the beleaguered troops with his confidence and his indomitable spirit. Garfield rode to Snodgrass Hill during the heaviest fighting, saw Thomas's determined stand, and that evening sent a dispatch to Rosecrans. Thomas standing like a rock, 7 divisions intact. Thomas thus became the Rock of Chickamauga, and at a reunion of the Army of the Cumberland in 1870, a few months after Thomas's death, Garfield gave a memorial oration in which he declared Thomas was indeed the Rock of Chickamauga. Against, Garfield continued, against which the wild waves of battle dashed in vain. It will stand forever in the annals of this country that there he saved from destruction the Army of the Cumberland. Now, although Thomas amply deserved the moniker Rock of Chickamauga, it has a larger significance because of the light that it casts on Rosecrans. It tacitly draws attention to Rosecrans' departure from the battlefield. Viewed objectively, Rosecrans' decision to leave the battlefield to organize Chattanooga for protracted defense as a rally point makes sense. Yet, the choice appears fatally weak when contrasted with Thomas's epic stand on Snodgrass Hill. In view of the fact that he held Rosecrans in high regard, then and later, this juxtaposition would have dismayed Thomas. Nevertheless, Rock of Chickamauga helps to frame Rosecrans as a badly flawed commander, a reputation that has clung to him ever since. The third pitfall was dug by Assistant Secretary of War Charles A. Dana, who happened to be with Rosecrans during the Chickamauga campaign. Dana was all but bodily swept from the battlefield, along with hundreds of demoralized soldiers making their way toward Chattanooga. The whole road was filled with flying soldiers, he recalled. Here and there were pieces of artillery, caissons, and wagons. Everything was in the greatest disorder. When he reached the town, Dana went first to the telegraph office and fired off a terse dispatch to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. My report today is of deplorable importance, it began. Chickamauga is as fatal a name in our history as Bull Run, the humiliating July 1861 defeat that had ruined all chance of a quick end to the Civil War. By 8 p.m. that evening, Dana realized that the situation was not as bad as all that. But that first telegram set the tone for what the Lincoln administration would perceive as the outcome of the Battle of Chickamauga. And subsequently, it appeared to Dana that Rosecrans himself perceived it that way. In the weeks that followed, Dana remained with Rosecrans and came to have a profoundly negative impression of Rosecrans. With the Army of the Cumberland now almost completely cut off from resupply by Braxton Bragg's victorious army, which all but surrounded the town, Rosecrans, quote, seemed to be insensible to the impending danger. This is Dana writing now. I have never seen a public man possessing talent with less administrative power, less clearness and steadiness in difficulty, and greater practical incapacity than General Rosecrans. That scathing assessment appeared in Dana's memoirs, published in 1898, the same year that Rosecrans passed away. Yet because neither Charles A. Dana nor his memoirs are well known, his assessment of Rosecrans would not have affected old Rosie's reputation, but for one thing. Dana made his opinion of Rosecrans clear in numerous telegrams to the War Department, all of them read by Lincoln, who had at his side a private secretary, John Hay, and Hay kept a diary. in which he recorded anything memorable his Moss had to say. In his entry for October 24th, 1863, John Hay wrote, quote, "I asked the president what Dana thought about Rosecrans. He said he agreed that Rosecrans was, for the present, completely broken down. The president says he is, quote, confused and stunned like a duck hit over the head, unquote, ever since Chickamauga. This earthy simile, like a duck hit on the head, stuck. Nearly a century later, when historian T. Harry Williams published his influential study, Lincoln and His Generals, his unsparing chapter on Rosecrans would be entitled, Like a Duck Hit on the Head." Wood, Garfield, Dana, and Lincoln, by way of his secretary's diary. It's certain that Wood meant to dig a pitfall for Rosecrans. Dana may not have meant to do so with the Bull Run analogy in his telegram to Stanton, but plainly he did not regret it. Garfield would probably not have been happy about the way in which his characterization of George Thomas as the Rock of Chickamauga came tacitly at the expense of Rosecrans. And Lincoln, I feel confident, would have been disheartened to see his characterization of Rosecrans as a duck hit on the head become so embedded in Rosecrans' reputation. But no one dug a pitfall for the reputation of William Stark Rosecrans more deliberately or with greater glee than Ulysses S. Grant, who is not only credited as one of the top commanders in U.S. military history, but who also wrote one of the best-known memoirs in American letters. The genius of Grant's memoirs are their direct, unadorned, yet vivid prose, and the way in which they seem to be simply giving a compelling account of the Civil War. What seems to be is the operative phrase, because in his memoirs, Grant settled a number of personal scores. And one of the bitterest was with Rosecrans, whom he detested after discovering that Rosecrans had criticized his handling of the now obscure Battle of Iuka, Mississippi in late September 1862. In late October 1863, Grant was placed in command of the newly created Military Division of the Mississippi, which gave him charge over all Union troops between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, including the Army of the Cumberland. Authorized to retain Rosecrans in command or put Thomas in his place, Grant unhesitatingly did the latter. In his memoirs, Grant described making the journey by rail and then by horseback to Chattanooga, and says that on the evening of October 21st, the train that carried him encountered a train carrying Rosecrans, Stevenson, Alabama. So Grant is heading toward Chickamauga. Rosecrans has been relieved and is heading away from Chattanooga. Grant's heading toward Chattanooga. Rosecrans is heading away. Here's Grant now talking about a meeting between himself and Rosecrans in his railroad car. I'm quoting now. "He, Rosecrans, came into my car," Grant wrote, "and we held a brief interview in which he described very clearly the situation at Chattanooga and made some excellent suggestions as to what should be done. My only wonder was that he had not carried them out." That brief interview with Grant would not be the end of Rosecrans' Civil War career. The War Department would send him to Missouri, where he would play a significant role in defending that crucial border state. And in the 35 years of life remaining to him, Rosecrans achieved notable success as a businessman and as a two-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1889, he would even return to the Chickamauga battlefield to give an address to Union and Confederate veterans in praise of the reconciliation of North and South. But he would never escape the shadow of the battle's second day, would never escape from the cumulative impact of those 5 metaphorical pitfalls. They would indelibly define his historical reputation. in that sense, William Stark Rosecrans will remain forever entrapped in perhaps the single worst moment of his life. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those powerful and stimulating remarks, Mark. And I particularly appreciate your comparison with the late Colin Powell as well, the introductory remarks that you made. I would now like to tell everyone first that this formal presentation will end at 8 p.m. Professor Grimsley has said that if there are more questions that remain to ask, he is happy to stay in the Zoom room with me and we will answer any and all questions, but we want you to know that you, of course, have our permission to leave at any time, but certainly at 8 o'clock, this program will formally end. I would encourage everyone, if possible, before you leave the Zoom room, to post a birthday greeting to Dick Smith. It's his 98th birthday tomorrow, and he will be looking at the chat, I understand. So if you could just wish him a birthday greeting before you leave the Zoom room this evening, I think that would be very appreciated by Dick and the family. But now, I know that Professor Grimsley looks forward to trying to answer any and all questions that you might have. So if you could either raise your hand like this, or if you could use the raise the hand feature. Okay, I see a question from Barbara Turgeon. So I'm calling on you, Barbara. You ask the first question. Get us started.
Thank you, Mike. And first of all, I want everyone to know how appreciative I am of Mike's extra work. He's chair of the department. The chair always participates, but usually this is kind of like my lecture series, but I was benched due to an injury. And Mike and Don, of course, really helped me out. Okay, so Mark, my question to you is, in terms of Grant's criticisms of Rosecrans, if it had been Grant who was the commander that day, would he have left the field? And I'm guessing that answer is no, he would not have. So how much, if I'm correct, Grant imagined himself in that situation would not have left the field until victory was assured. Do you think that that is in part, or how much in part, why he's so critical of Rosecrans?
Grant would not have written that order. One of the things that Grant knew how to do was calm down on a battlefield. The first day of the Battle of the Wilderness, probably one of the fiercest ones he was ever in. He sat whittling a stick for much of the day, and when officers arrived, all excited to him, around himself, what he exuded was a great deal of calm, a vast calm. So what he would have relied upon is what we call commander's intent. He would have relied upon his key commanders to understand what he wanted them to do, and then would have expected them to carry out his orders. In the case of giving an order to General Wood, had he felt the need to do it, it would have been a model of clarity. It's one of the things that's very striking about Grant's style of communication. In terms of what he would have done, had somehow or other he sort of been, suddenly went into Rosecrans' body after Rosecrans had sent out that order and after all hell had broken loose. No, I don't see Grant leaving the field. The closest approach to that I can think of is Shiloh, and far from leaving the field, Grant traveled to it and stayed there. Let's see another hand going up. So let's move on, and because I've got this whole screen of someone with their hand up waiting to say something. So,
Mark, why don't you call on that person, because I don't see the hand. So
okay, it was funny because all of a sudden it's Jim Epperson.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing good. An issue in the Grant-Rosecrans relationship always comes back to Iuka. And after Iuka, there were accusations that Grant was drunk that could be traced to Rosecrans' staff. And I think that had a lot, full caps, to do with the way Grant viewed Rosecrans, not only after Chickamauga and Chattanooga, but when he wrote his memoirs. It's just a natural human reaction to that kind of accusation.
Absolutely. Grant wrote two reports on the Battle of Iuka. The first one, almost immediately after it was fought, is actually full of praise with Rosecrans. Then he finds out what Rosecrans, how Rosecrans characterizes him, and then Grant's second report puts Rosecrans in a more dubious light. And yeah, Grant knew how to do a lot of things. Holding his temper, holding his peace in the middle of a fierce battle was one of them. Holding a grudge was another. And it took him. He got at Rosecrans actually in a number of ways. Rosecrans was briefly minister to Mexico right before Grant took office, and when Grant took office, he got jerked out of that post. And so no, Grant never forgot. And here's Grant when he's writing his memoirs. For those who don't know about Grant writing his memoirs, he's writing them as he's dying of throat cancer. And so he's literally, time is running out on him. He's writing these memoirs because they're literally gonna keep his wife and from going destitute when they're published. And so in the midst of that, when you might have thought, well, he could, here's an opportunity for some grandeur of spirit. You're on death's door, and what are you gonna do? No, nope. He went after Rosecrans. He went after Halleck. He went after all kinds of other generals that had done him wrong. And did it eloquently in a way that doesn't look too closely like he's sticking the knife in their back.
Mark, could I just ask you quickly, did Wood ever suffer any repercussions for his action?
No, that's what it kills me. He wound up commanding a corps at the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. So no, I don't know. The weird thing about it also, as long as we're talking about Wood, is that during that battle, he gave a nickname to the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, called them the Tigers, Updike's Tigers. Colonel Updike was the colonel, so it's Updike's Tigers, and they loved that nickname, called them the Tigers. And the fact that they lost 30-40% of their strength in that battle at Snodgrass Hill, essentially trying to save the army from the full impact of Wood's blunder, made no difference to them. They remembered Wood fondly. He called us the Tigers, So what people deserve to get and what they do get are often, very different things. Pat, boy, I see you're waving your hand. Pat, yes, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Let's see.
Here we are. Yes, thank you very much for your participation in this. Did Grant and Rosecrans ever meet face to face after the war was completely over? And if so, what sort of results came of that?
They might have done. I don't, but I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know. I don't think so, but I could be mistaken about that. I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer, but that's all I got.
No problem. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Brad Keeler. Kiefer, excuse me.
Thank you. Can we add Phil Sheridan to the list of pitfalls? Because I seem to recall that Sheridan, at the last minute in the waning hours of Chickamauga, rounded up some troops and marched back towards Thomas. And as he tells it in his memoirs, and I'm not sure who wrote their memoirs first, Grant or Sheridan, he said, "Oh yeah, we got to Thomas, and Thomas said, we got him right where we want him. And if Rosecrans hadn't ordered us to retreat, we could win the battle." Now, I don't know if Thomas said that, because Thomas never, first of all, wouldn't have undermined Rosecrans, and second, never wrote his memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
And then little Phil goes east and becomes a star under Grant. Coincidence?
Yeah. I didn't realize that Sheridan goes after Rosecrans either, but of course Rosecrans, sorry, Sheridan, Sherman, and Grant, the three Ohioans, are sort of the triumvirate that, in memory at least, are responsible for the great Union victory. And so it's interesting to think that except for Chickamauga, maybe Rosecrans might have been the third member of that triumvirate in place of one of the other two. I don't know. Of course, another thing too, Brad, of course, is that if one could argue, and I think Grant would argue, and probably so would Sheridan and others, that life has a way of finding you out. And life would have found Rosecrans out. Something in the war would have revealed his true character, if not on the second day of the Battle of Chickamauga, then at some other point. And yet, all three of those, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, had really lousy days, or what potentially could have been really lousy days. And they escaped those and became figures of legend, and that was a fate denied to Rosecrans. Robert, Jacquard, is that how it's pronounced? You'll need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you for pronouncing the name correctly, and thank you for your presentation. I have a very, very personal relationship with Chickamauga. My great-grandfather, Charles Jacquot, who had just immigrated from Switzerland to leave the wars in Switzerland, volunteered with the 92nd Ohio Regiment out of Marietta, Ohio, and he ended up at Chickamauga. He was shot. His fellow comrades thought he had died. They put him behind a tree. And when the battle was over, they went to get him, and it turned out the bullet had hit his belt and he was fine. So he survived the war, thank goodness, or I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
One thing I was interested in, Mark, was I went back today actually and looked at some of the letters written by one by the surgeon of the 92nd Ohio, who was a Dr. Cotton from Marietta, a very distinguished physician in Marietta, and then also the adjutant of the regiment, a young man by the name of Turner, George Butler Turner, who actually had just graduated first in his class at Marietta, and he and several of his classmates joined the 92nd. Sadly, he was killed at Missionary Ridge. But I looked at their letters and curious about what their reaction was to the defeat. And they actually said nothing about it. Their letters talked about the great victory that the 92nd Regiment and the first Brigade of the 2nd Division. And the 1st Brigade was led by General John Basil Turchin, who was a Russian immigrant. And they had nothing but high praise. And they said, the battle was won because of General Turchin and so forth. But I was curious if this was common for, I can't say that they were the average soldier. I mean, they were officers, but whether soldiers talked about, oh, gee, General Rosecrans was a disaster and that sort of thing.
The world of Civil War soldiers, in terms of the organization that meant the most to them was their regiment.
Exactly.
And what you're talking about is actually fairly typical, that the way in which soldiers would write home about the outcome of a battle would turn very much on how their own regiment or their brigade or or whatever unit they identified strongly with, how that unit had done. Mm-hmm. And so that's not at all uncommon. Yes. We done great. Oh, by the way, the rest of the Army's kind of screwed up, but we did fine.
Exactly. So, thank you.
So you do have that, yeah.
Mark, I just wanted to ask, clearly the voters of Ohio, or at least in the congressional district, weren't bothered by this. You mentioned Rosecrans served a couple of terms in the House of Representatives. Is that that's
Not from
correct?
Ohio, I don't think.
Oh,
I
not from
think
Ohio. Okay.
California.
California,
He actually bought a lot of land out in Southern California and died Redondo Beach, which is actually that was a ranch that he owned originally. But yeah, he was I think he was a congressman from Ohio. He was also often asked by both parties to run for high office. Supposedly, he was approached to run as Lincoln's running mate in 1864. I don't think so, but people have said that. He was definitely approached to run for the vice president slot, run for governor. I think he was invited to run for governor of Ohio at one point, and he kept turning down all these offers. He had a reputation as what's called the Great Decliner. He didn't think that any of these offers were worth compromising his business, his business career. But it's interesting, when you give a public lecture, you kind of have to paint in bold strokes. And I do think that Rosecrans is indeed defined by that second day at Chickamauga. But it doesn't mean that people ran from him screaming for the rest of his life and didn't want his endorsement and didn't want his support and so on.
Mhm.
I don't see another question coming. There's a
Jesse Tierney, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Professor Grimsley, I was wondering why, out of your 5 pitfalls, you mentioned Charles Dana and Abraham Lincoln and didn't focus on Secretary of War Stanton, who's seemingly sent Charles Dana out to the battlefield to basically spy on Rosecrans and report. Apparently, they didn't have a very good relationship to start.
Yeah, of course. Stanton also sent Dana out to spy on Grant, and so Dana had been out there during the Vicksburg campaign to check on Grant as well. There were a lot of people that Stanton was suspicious of, and Rosecrans was one, but Grant, for a while was another one. And Dana was particularly good at this kind of serving as sort of the eyes of an important executive. I think, and that's actually too. It's true that people who the sort of powerful men need powerful eyes, and Stanton knew that, and Dana was very good at this because he was actually by trade. Dana was a journalist, and so very good at observation, very good at interviewing people, drawing people out, and so on, and very good at writing, lucidly and well. But no, Stanton just didn't have it in for Rosecrans. Stanton could very well have it in for you, Jesse. I'm just saying, he was that kind of guy.
Thanks.
Sure.
Do you see any more questions, Mark? I do not. I'm looking around.
I don't either, but listen, I do see a hand. It's Pat.
Yes, this time it actually is Pat.
Jesse Tierney.
I'm curious, you mentioned he didn't want to leave his business. Was he successful in his business, and what was it?
Yes, he actually was involved with several businesses. Before the war, he did he owned a refinery, did kerosene. That's when he had the badly named sort of safety lamp blew up in his face. That was the refinery in Cincinnati. Afterward, he got interested in railroads. He got interested in business in intersection between business and government. He owned a large ranch, as I said, out in California, and he sort of did a variety of things. And frankly, Pat, I'm not a student of Rosecrans' business career, so all I know is that he was involved in these kinds of things and did well at them. But to go more deeply into it, I really can't do. It's one of the great downsides of not being being an absolute expert on your topic. It's sort of frightening because it's kind of like, hey, that lecture I gave, it's pretty much everything I know. It's not as bad as all that, but it's
Max, I think. Is that right, Max? I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I want to know if was his family a military family in any sense, and did they carry on afterwards when he died, or Was he the only one that had any military background?
They were Roman Catholic with a vengeance, and his brother was a Roman Catholic bishop. And I would say that the family tradition really was being devoutly Roman, Roman Catholic. And I haven't looked at his descendants, but I don't know that he had any, I don't think there was a sort of a military arc to his descendants. But the Roman Catholicism was very, very well pronounced. In fact, one of the things that Charles A. Dana says in his recollections is he wakes up from a nap and he sees that the musketry's gotten very, very loud, and he sees Rosecrans crossing himself. And he's like, oh no, things are bad. The general's crossing himself. Up next. So no, more than being a military kind of family, I would say that Rosecrans, Catholicism is what is striking about his family from what I can see of it.
Thank you very much. So I'm guessing, had his family come over recently to the United States, right? As you said.
I think that's right. I think that perhaps his grandfather, had come over, and the name was probably Rosecrans. I think it was anglicized, possibly Rosencrantz, possibly goes back to Hamlet. We just don't know. But no, and I will say that's flippant. But I will say that sometimes people misspelled his name as Rosencrantz and so forth. But yes, I think that. He would not have thought of himself really as, being an immigrant would not have been part of his own identity. But as with many people, many Americans of his time and place, his immigrant groups were fairly recent.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, well, I don't believe that I see any more hands. Oh, wait, I do. Cole, go ahead. You'll get the last question, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it quick then. So I believe both Sherman also had a similar track. He went into business, skipped the Mexican-American War. Do you think Rosecrans gets more of a bad rap than Sherman, because Sherman kind of started out poor and then obviously goes on to become one of the great commanders, whereas Rosecrans starts out fairly well and then has that drop off at Chickamauga?
Well, Sherman in a way starts off poor, but by the time he's 10 years old, he and his brother get turned over to the family down the street, the Ewing family, Thomas Ewing family. And they are rich as all get out. You go down to Lancaster now and you can see the Sherman house where he grew up, and you can see the mansion where he really grew up. And by the way, married his foster sister, kind of weird. But it was a very prominent political family, not just wealthy, but well connected. His brother John became a U.S. Senator. He had a host of other relatives who were involved with political life, and it was really that saved William T. Sherman when he had a bad depression in the autumn of 1861 and was sent home. Anybody else, and was thought of as being crazy. Anybody with fewer political connections than Sherman had, that probably would have been the end for him. As it was, he was able to come back.
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you for all of your questions. Mark, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Really, really interesting and timely remarks. I would like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And above all, I would like to thank Dick Smith for really, truly making this evening and many other wonderful evenings and classes possible. And so let's give a round of applause for our speaker and for Dick, and Zoom applause. And if you have not already sent a birthday greeting or message to Dick via chat, please do so. And otherwise, have a very good evening and stay healthy, everyone. Thanks again for joining us.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I don't know. Meeting? Mm-hmm.
Thank you again, Mark. That was really terrific.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. And
Me too, Barb here, and Fred listened too, Mark. It was really great.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I appreciate it.